The Charlotte Ledger Podcast is a member of the Queen City Podcast Network.
Hey, it's Tony Mecia with the Charlotte Ledger, and you're listening to the Charlotte Ledger Podcast. The Ledger is a local media company that provides smart and reliable information to the Charlotte area. Sign up for our newsletters at thecharlotteledger.com. Today, I'm sharing a conversation I had with Grace Weisiger. She's a Charlotte investor and entrepreneur and the founder of Willow Hill, a private investment vehicle that's looking to acquire a scalable business. We'll talk about search funds, her family's four-generation family business, the Weisiger Group. You might have recognized her name. The Weisiger Group was formerly Carolina Tractor and Equipment. And we'll also talk about her time as an early employee of the dating app Bumble, and a lot more. But first, I want to let you know about the sponsor of today's podcast with Grace. Look, independent sponsors move fast. Your insurance broker should too. USI specializes in supporting deal makers like you with coverage strategies built for speed, certainty, and scalability. From diligence to closing to portfolio management, USI delivers risk solutions that keep pace with your pipeline and protect every stage of the investment cycle. USI, the broker built for independent sponsors and the private equity model. Visit usi.com to learn more. Okay, now on to my conversation with Grace Weisiger. Well, Grace, thanks for joining me.
Thanks for having me. Excited to be here.
Well, I always love talking to people who are on different career paths, and there's so many ways that people take to kind of get to where it is that they're going. And you're on, I think, a really interesting one. I just think there's a lot to learn and a lot to unpack on sort of where you've been and where you're headed. Now, people might recognize your name, Weisiger. The Weisiger Group, I think, is well known in Charlotte. Family company, private company, well known. It used to be known as CTE, or Carolina Tractor and Equipment. It was founded in 1926 by L.M. Weisiger, which, if my research is correct, was your great-grandfather. Is that correct?
Yep, that's correct.
Kind of kept it here in Charlotte, grown, and now it's become really the Southeast's leading equipment provider. Recently, your dad, Edward Weisiger Jr., handed the reins of the day-to-day operation to your sister, Amanda Weisiger Cornelson, right?
Yes, Cornelson.
Okay, sorry. And so you've been in this family, this entrepreneurial local business family for a while. What was that like growing up in that family?
Yeah, absolutely. I know it's been a privilege and to really grow up in this family and see this business grow. The business has now been around, as you mentioned, for almost 100 years, and it's lived many lives in that time. Really started as a Caterpillar dealership here in North Carolina, and over the years expanded across material handling, expanded across some technology investments, some real estate. But I think the one thing that's been really interesting and what I was able to learn, especially, from our early days growing up, going out to the dealership with our dad on a Saturday and Sunday, but also just some of our dinner table conversations was, how my dad, my sister, my grandfather, great-grandfather have always treated people, whether it was how they worked with their employees, how they worked with our customers. And then really that's what helped us get through some hard times. They always tell this story, back in the late 20s, early 30s, when the business was, really struggling throughout Great Depression. And there was a lot of grit, that our great-grandfather displayed to kind of get through that phase. And he had really kind of had to pivot the business entirely, starting to sell bottle caps and detergent to get through the Depression. And I think that was something that was really interesting for me to hear about and understand, especially kind of early on in our childhood and so on, of kind of what does it mean to run a business? What does it mean to run a family business? And then how do we kind of be a good steward in our community? How can we, while we're going to be employing a huge number of people, what does that really mean every day? And how can we kind of be better every day in that? And so there's a huge line of kind of continuous improvement that you hear throughout our operations every day at the business. And I think it's a really kind of key part and key thing that I learned, that's helped for me as a leader as well.
Any anecdotes that stand out? Any times where your dad would come and there was a business problem and you'd talk through it, or times where you went out and saw some things, and said, well, oh, why do we do it that way? And it sort of had to be told, oh, here's the way we do it. Anything like that stand out?
I think actually what's interesting as you asked that is, so I joined the board of the company, I guess it was probably bit over 5 years ago now. And that was really when I started to sink my teeth in understanding what was going on day to day and able to ask a lot of those questions. Why do we do it this way? Why don't we do it this way instead? And I think what's really interesting is that, while yes, there's certain things that we do a certain way because it's the right thing to do, or it's the way that we've learned it through some of our partners like Caterpillar or something like that. But there's never been this kind of like hard-headedness or stubbornness. We're not doing it the way, our great grandfather did or our grandfather did it just because that's the way things have been done. But instead, we're always trying to kind of pave that new path and build something new. While yes, we can look back and learn from some of our past ways of doing things, we're also trying to, as I mentioned, really continuously improve and change the way we're doing things to do them better than ever before.
And it's really interesting, I think, talking to you. A lot of times I think in family businesses or, the children will see the parents running something a certain way. They'll become familiar with it. And they either say, I want to go into that business, or they'll say, I've seen everything you're going through and I definitely don't want to be involved in that business. You still sort of kept your hand in it. It sounds like a little bit, but what did the experience, with your family business, how did that make you think about your future and your career and what you wanted to do?
Yeah, absolutely. So we actually were highly encouraged to work outside of the business, especially early on in our career. It was part of our family employment policy. If you want to come work at this business, you need to go get some outside experience, and then you can come bring that back to the company. And that's exactly what I did. So I'd always kind of felt this interest of working on new, pretty shiny, fun objects. And that led me to working in technology and working, across a couple of different software businesses and things like that, but especially Bumble, the dating app.
Yeah, I want to dig into that a little bit because that's obviously a name I think a lot of people recognize. These dating apps, they've really come on strong in the last, 10 plus years or so. I mean, it's now really one of the major ways that people meet each other is on these dating apps. It's not so much the, go out to the bar or go to the gym or whatever and you meet somebody there, but they've really taken off. But you, even before you graduated from the University of Georgia, you started working with Bumble. You were there very early. There's a company I think that started in 2014, I believe. How did you get linked up with Bumble, and what was that like?
Yeah, I always tell the story because I think it's now, given the number of like spam phone calls and random numbers that call every day. If I had gotten this call today, I probably would have blocked the number. But I got this call from someone her name was Caroline. She's now the chief of staff at Bumble, and she was really the first employee beyond our founder. And she said, "Hey, I got your number from a friend of a friend. I can't tell you what we're doing, but we're starting a company and it's going to be huge and we'd like you to be a part of it." And
it sounds like any kind of internet comment, like, oh, ever we're going to be huge. It's going to be big. It's going to be the greatest thing. You can get in on the ground floor. It sounds almost kind of scammy, right?
Exactly. Which is why I think I would probably block the call if I got it now about 10 years later. But for some reason, I just had this like gut feeling. I knew that friend, that mutual connection decently well, and said, okay, tell me more. And we ended up for the next couple of weeks talking a little bit more. She was slowly able to give me a little bit more information about kind of who was starting it, what it was going to be called, what we were going to do. And the biggest thing that hooked me was really the mission. Our goal was to empower women and to create a more equitable and safer place for women to date.
Okay, because I'm guessing at the time these apps were just kind of taking off, right? There was Tinder, I think, but there weren't a whole lot of others, right? This is still fairly early.
Exactly, and there were some of the Match.coms and things like that were, some of the more legacy dating services. But Tinder was kind of the behemoth in the space that had really started with some of the more like truly like app-based dating on, the iPhone, of being able to interact with people in your area quickly. And so it was really fun just being able to say, okay, we understand what's going on in this market. We like what's going on in this market, but we want to do it differently. We want to do it in a way that, we really care about and that we deeply believe in. And that's what we were able to really create this kind of cult followership from, which was really interesting.
So what was the value proposition of Bumble, vis-a-vis the other competitors in the marketplace? Was it the women empowerment? Like the women have to start the conversations, I think, right at the time, or something like that?
Exactly. And so, as similar platforms may have been location based or something like that, but what we really kind of changed was we wanted women to make the first move. We wanted women to be in control of the conversation and having more of that freedom to decide who and what, who they wanted to date, but also what they, what was the foundation that they were going to build that relationship off of. And that was really interesting. I think there was a lot of naysayers in the game that said women will never do this. Women are so used to men coming to them that this will never work. And, we just so deeply believed in that mission that we were able to power through a lot of those no's and a lot of those naysayers.
It is pretty funny. If you look at a lot of the tech companies that were founded, I think around that time or a little bit earlier, they all have these sort of chip on their shoulder stories. Like people said this would never work. Like I think of like Airbnb. It was like, people are not going to want to stay in some random person's apartment or house. That's just not going to work. Or Uber. Like people are not going to want to get in some stranger's car and be driven around. But it's like if you have a vision of the way things can change, you can really, you can actually build a pretty good business off of that.
Yeah, absolutely. And there was this quote I remember hearing kind of early in our days, and it was old Socrates quote, which is kind of random, but it was the secret of change is to focus all of your energy not on fighting the old, but on building the new. And I think that was something that really resonated with me as we were doing this. Of we weren't necessarily trying to change everyone's opinion or change everyone's history of what they were used to believing, but instead we wanted to offer them something new to believe in and a new way of doing something, which was really allowing the women to come first and allowing the women to be in charge of their relationships. And, that was also there was a huge momentum just in our society of that, of, building this, safer, more, just like equitable communities. And so it went well beyond dating. And, while yes, our core was a dating app, there was, the way that we were able to develop followership was well beyond just being a dating app.
So what did you do there exactly in helping build this company up?
Yeah. So I spent most of my time on our community marketing team. And so what that really entailed was building out our ambassador programs from, our college marketing throughout all of our major markets here in the US, but also abroad, which were really a lot of our boots on the ground. It was our guerrilla marketing. It was, people who were essentially our brand advocates and salesmen all over the world, saleswomen that could.
So what does that look like on a college campus? I'm just curious how that works. Is it you send some ambassadors to a party, you encourage them, hey, everybody, check this out, or what do you do exactly?
Yeah, exactly. So we had worked with them in a couple different capacities. So we had different people in different roles based on what their strong suits were. So whether it was they were working on guerrilla marketing and they were getting like posters out, billboards, things like that. There were people that were working on partnerships with local businesses, everything from the workout studios that everyone was going to the bars that you're talking about, having some of those parties where, we had everyone, really just living and breathing the Bumble mission. And, our biggest goal was how do we get Bumble to be a part of the day-to-day conversation? How do we get it organically brought up at, dinner tables? We never had our ambassadors, walking around with a QR code saying, hey, please download this app so I get paid or so I get, something, $1 for every download or something. Instead we were basically trying to leverage these ambassadors to educate our consumer base on what we had, what we were offering. And that would help lead to new customer acquisition and retention. We felt that was a way more sustainable way to grow versus, if somebody just downloads immediately, for their friend or on the QR code, they're likely not going to know to use the app or even think to use the app again. And so while we were able to leverage kind of these small communities, we were able to kind of create this ripple effect and this network effect, which was so important because we were building a marketplace.
So you were there for, I think, a little over 6 years. The company went public in 2021. I think you left, shortly after that, right? I think it was valued at the time of the IPO about $7 billion, raised about $2.2 billion, I think, out of the IPO. Looking back on that experience at Bumble, and I know it's been a few years, but what do you feel like you learned there? What did that make you realize? And I know, you're saying that, you were encouraged as a kid to kind of have those experiences, not having anything to do with, equipment rentals or sales, anything like that. What do you feel like you learned from that time?
I think one thing that was really interesting was we really just put on our blinders and we just built. We wanted to stay true to ourselves. We had this really great mission. We had these really clear values. We knew who we wanted to be. in the, in the overall tech ecosystem and in the overall world. And that was able to help us shut out the noise. It's, what some of our competitors were doing, or, should we be doing something else that, whoever or whatever new tech company was doing. We always had that mission to fall back on in all of our decision making, which I think was really interesting and a little bit unique. Because I think as someone who, is a little bit ADD, I can also get distracted with the shiny object problem of, okay, well, should we be doing that? Should we be doing that? Should we be doing that? And instead, this allowed us to just stay so dialed in what we were doing. And even though we were, a bunch of 20 somethings running around more or less like headless chickens, and those early days were chaotic, there was that consistency, there was that stability that we were able to kind of lean back onto through that foundation.
Just of putting your head down, tuning out. I mean, you obviously you pay attention to what's going on in the marketplace, but I think you're right. I think a lot of entrepreneurs and operators, a lot of times they see, well, everybody's sort of running that direction, and this is the hot thing. Should we go kind of do something in that direction, or do we just sort of stay? I mean, I think you always have to adapt to changing circumstances, certainly, but 6 years is not all that in the grand scheme of things. It's not that long of an arc. And so I would think that, I mean, you could kind of keep your head down for a few years and do pretty well, right?
Yeah, exactly. And I think, frankly, some of it probably helped that we were a little bit young and we were a little bit naive. We hadn't learned what the right ways of doing things were. We had to build all of that from scratch. Most of us, some in those early days, like, yes, there might have been some, early career experiences and things like that. But a lot of, the people that we were hiring, this was their first job. And we were able to just kind of say, okay, we're all going to wear every hat and we're all going to do whatever it takes to grow. And I think that's what kept us scrappy. There was no job or task that was like, below anyone. We were all just kind of willing to get our hands dirty. And that was a ton of fun.
I love that. It's just, everybody kind of coming together, not with any preconceived notions, or not like, well, I spent 20 years at this place and we're doing it all wrong. It's like this sort of it's on the one hand, you could say there's probably some things about it that are naive. On the other hand, you're probably looking at it and like, there's some things that are just really great about that you don't know. You don't know what you don't know. And so it's like you could take this direction, you could take this business any direction, and there's just a lot of possibility. And that's kind of a nice mentality to have too.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and then we also never let, perfection get in the way of progress. I think because we didn't know what perfection was. And so we would just get a lot of shots on goal. And I mean, I remember talking about this even in the early days of like, some days it truly felt like we were just kind of throwing darts at the wall to try to see what would stick. But, we had these really immediate feedback loops from those ambassador programs, from, these boots on the ground that we had in every different country. And we had a wonderful analytics team. We were able to figure out really quickly what was working and what was not working and where we wanted to spend more time.
This podcast is presented by Hillendale Advisors and the Private Business Roundtable. Join local and free events in Charlotte, Raleigh, and Winston-Salem. Learn more at www.privatebusinessroundtable.com. Great. I'd like to fast forward a little bit to where you are now. After you left Bumble, you went to business school at Wharton, got an MBA, and now you're involved in what's called a search fund. Can you tell me a little bit about, this was something I was not previously aware of, maybe in investing circles it's better known, but can you explain to me what that is and what you're doing?
Yeah, absolutely. And you're not alone. A lot of people don't know what this is. And so a search fund is at its core a private investment vehicle. So I've raised outside capital from a group of investors. It's about a third is more institutional private equity, a third is family office, and a third is high net worth. Where we differ from kind of a traditional private equity fund is that I'm looking for one business to buy to operate full time versus building out kind of a full portfolio of businesses like you might see a more traditional private equity group do.
Right. So traditionally you would have investors that would find a company, they put money into a company or a range of companies with the hope that one of them pays off or ideally all of them. But realistically, you're hoping for one whale or one huge exit or something like that. But from my understanding, the difference is here, rather than actually investing in a company, they're basically investing in you. They're saying, listen, we like your background. We like what you've done. We're entrusting you with some money. Go find a company, buy it, run it. And I think some of the articles suggest that can, for many investors, be a better outcome than just sort of investing in actual, startup companies. Do I kind of have that right?
Yeah, exactly. And so the asset class now, it's an average 35% IRR, which is a really compelling growth rate for a lot of investor capital. And so we've seen a lot more money flooding into this asset class over the years, but it's been around since the 80s. And, there's a huge demand for it. And the way, that you can really look at this is looking at the number of, baby boomers that are retiring every day. So what I'm typically looking for is a business that is a little bit smaller in size, kind of that small, mid-sized private business. It's between 2 to 10 million of EBITDA or maybe 5 to 50 million of revenue. So it's not this huge behemoth of a company, but maybe it's the market leader and, in a certain region or in a certain industry or something like that. But I'm often talking to retiring owners or CEOs that don't have a succession plan and they're looking to exit. So a lot of the time, these retiring owners, they may look really similar to what our family business looked like at one point. And, where they might not have that son or daughter to take it over. And I'm able to kind of position myself as that son or daughter that they might not have and can say, okay, I'm going to take care of your business. I come from this family business background. I know what it means to preserve your legacy, to be a good steward in the community, but also to grow this, especially taking into account kind of that high growth tech mentality that I bring. And so it's been really fun to kind of look at this in a new light of, I'm getting to wear this dual hat of both being an investor and an operator, but really trying to sink my teeth into one business to really focus all my time on.
That's really interesting. I think probably a lot of people listening would be like, wow, that would be great. I would love to be in that kind of a situation. How do you, and obviously you have a background, in entrepreneurship and running business. How does one position themselves if they said, wow, I'd like to get involved in that? Well, like, what are some of the things that you need to do, or what are some of the pedigrees that you need to have?
In order to run a search fund or raise a search fund? I mean, there's a couple different paths. There's one is like a more traditional search fund, which is the route that I chose. And I spent a lot of time building relationships with investors in the space. There's platforms like Search Funder that you're able to go onto, searchfunder.com, where you can see a lot of the investors in the space. You can learn a lot about this path. There's also what a lot of people call like the self-funded search, which is really people taking on personal capital, personal risk to go acquire a business. You might be doing that through an SBA loan. So you could talk to kind of any, local banks and things like that about with that path. And there's also this third model, which is an accelerator, where, you're kind of in this almost like you think of a startup incubator. It's basically that, but for this. And there's some really great investors there's one based here in Charlotte, there's another in Chicago, there's, another in Boston, New Orleans, Dallas. There's a handful that I can think of where you actually are working with them day to day, where you're truly working in their office. And, you might have a more traditional relationship with them, like it's kind of the private equity fund where you're employed by them. But whereas the other two paths might give you a little bit more autonomy to start as well.
So what is the process like right now? I mean, what exactly are you looking at? What day to day? How do you find these potential companies? What sort of screening do you employ? What's your thinking on and I know you mentioned some of the financial figures, but tell me a little bit about what exactly you're doing to find the company that you'd like to lead.
Yeah. So in terms of how I'm finding them, I use a couple of different databases that have some private company data, things like that may have the name of the company description, estimated revenue, estimated employee count, and things like that. That can be a starting place for me to just start sourcing some of these. However, I have definitely found most of my leads and the best leads really through, building relationships, going to different networking events, going to whether it's different conferences or trade shows, and just getting the word out there and sharing kind of a little bit about myself and a little bit kind of about what we can do from an investing standpoint as well. I think that's really what resonates with a lot of these owners is being able to actually build that trust and have this reputation to kind of go back on that helps you differentiate yourself as a buyer. Because, what I've realized is when I'm, sending out a cold email to, 100 different business owners on a Monday or something, many of them will respond and say, hey, I get 12 emails like yours a week, and so how do you stand out? How do you actually build that trust? Over an email, it's a little bit harder. And so I think the more time that you can get in the field and starting to get to know people, the better. But we've tried to get really dialed in on, some of what are we looking for, whether that's, we're looking at these really strong industries that, are not incredibly cyclical, but they also have a pretty compelling growth rate. Maybe it's greater than a 7% CAGR. We're looking for businesses that have pretty high recurring or repeat revenue, and pretty much all B2B revenue is really where I focus my time on. And then I'm looking a lot at kind of having great customer relationships. And that's often told through high revenue retention, high logo retention, and little to no customer concentration. But I think like the key thing here is I also look a lot at the people. And I think that's the same way that a lot of my search investors probably looked at me as the person to bet on. I'm also looking at the management company and the culture of these businesses, of trying to get to know the people really well, trying to understand, the employees, trying to understand the customers, trying to understand the kind of the market that they're operating in. And then how can I be a value add to that? So I think when I start thinking about the how can I be a value add to this business, that's what leads me into looking at a lot of technology businesses. It leads me into looking at a lot of tech-enabled B2B services, just due to kind of some of my network, due to some of my background and operating experience. But also look at a lot of industrials, a lot of infrastructure-related services too, just given the family operating company as well.
Right. So you've been looking, how long has the search been going on? How's it going? Have you gotten close? Are you encouraged? Are you discouraged? Where do you sit on that?
Yeah. So I'm about 18 months into the search, which has been great so far. I mean, I've learned a ton. I think especially knowing that I come from more of an operating background and this is wearing much more of an investor hat. It's been really interesting to kind of work on a deal process, go through what does it mean to diligence a business? What does it mean to kind of get this under the hood view? I'm definitely still very encouraged. We've gotten close on a couple of things, but what's cool about this is we just need one. We're able to really kind of spend time and being a little bit more patient with our capital to make sure we're deploying capital for the right asset and the right business, but also that I can be the right successor to that, retiring owner or CEO.
Well, great. Well, we're just about out of time. Just any parting thoughts, any bits of advice to people, anything that you wish you had known maybe when you were younger and starting out? How can I know I've just asked like 5 questions, but any thoughts?
No, I love it. I mean, I think one thing that I definitely underestimated how much it would matter in all kind of operating capacity, whether it's, through the early days of Bumble, whether it was through our family business, whether it was through kind of this newer investing role, operating role, hybrid. It really is the importance of people and who you have around you, who you kind of have on your bench to support you and things like that, because times get tough. And, I almost every day I'm told that somebody doesn't want to sell their business to me for various reasons. And it's nice to kind of have, this group of people to lean on, both for support during those moments, but also to be cheerleaders throughout it. And, many of them also have a ton of advice to share and a ton of guidance and mentorship too. And I think that's been really key is, even though I'm in this, currently I'm in this career path that feels a little bit siloed. Most days I'm working pretty independently because I'm not necessarily in the office every day with some of my investors. It's really nice to have some of that community that can also open up some of those doors for me. But it's really cool to see that throughout, how much we've relied on people and our employees who are the lifeblood of our family business, or how much it mattered to have the right people in the right seats during Bumble and throughout these different phases and seasons of the company. And so I think that's one thing that sometimes gets overlooked is, especially in an investment of, okay, yeah, we're going to buy this company. Maybe it doesn't have a great culture. Maybe it doesn't have a great leader, but that's okay. We'll change it out. We can change the management team or something like that. But I do think the importance of people is really key. And that's something I look for in almost everything I do.
Well, great. I think that's a great place to close. I think that's a great reminder that the IRL, the in real life connections really do still matter in a time where, a lot of this technology can facilitate a lot of it. It's still important to have people on your side, people on your team, and have people that are good with people. So anyway, I appreciate you joining me today.
100%. Thanks so much, Tony. I really appreciate it as well. Really enjoyed the conversation.
That's a wrap. This episode of the Charlotte Ledger Podcast is produced by Lindsey Banks. This podcast is presented by Hill & Dale Advisors, a Charlotte, North Carolina-based investment and advisory firm that provides strategic counsel to local business owners. Are you looking for support in capital raising, hiring key talent, or selling your business? Contact Matt at hillanddaleadvisors.com or learn more at www.hillanddaleadvisors.com.
QueenCityPodcastNetwork.com.